All right, let's get started. Um, I'm just gonna wait for a sec to get confirmation that my voice is audible, and then we can get started with today's slightly delayed webinar. All right, let's get started. Um, okay, so hi, my name is Rasavya. I'm a designer at Mapbox. I work on interaction design and I do data visualization. And today's webinar is going to be around designing with data. I'm just gonna make sure everyone's on the video on with the new link. So let's just give 2 more minutes to get everyone on here. Cool. So yes, sorry for all the technical snafu. Just gonna give some other people a few more minutes so that they can also join in with the new link. Okay, let's get started. So I'm hoping that whoever has been interested in this webinar is now online and on this YouTube link. Otherwise, you can always follow the video recording later. So again, to get started, hi, my name is Rasagya Sharma. I am a designer at Mapbox, and today we're going to talk about designing with data. So just to set some context, because going through the list of responses in the Google form, there's been some good mix of what people are expecting from this webinar. So the first question obviously is, what are we designing with data for? So there are two different approaches or two very different themes that emerge. One is around designing with data for making objective design decisions. This is generally known as data-driven design, data-informed design. The idea here is that you look at data while working in a design process and then make design decisions. So the very popular tale of Google using different sort of blue colors to figure out which blue color leads to the most conversions on their search page is one of those examples. This talk, however, is not specifically about this. Instead, what we're going to talk about is much more around understanding data and experiencing it. And that is generally known as information visualization, or a more broader term of data art. So a little bit about what I do at Mapbox. Mapbox is a platform for developers to build interesting things with maps. You can do a lot of customizability, which is what I majorly work on. I do a lot of custom cartography work. But apart from that, I also work on a couple of different data visualization projects. These could be things around looking at buildings, understanding the data quality there, looking at traffic, trying to understand how a city travels with different times, different days, and then trying to use that data to inform public policy. Or it could be around visualizing huge amount of geographic data onto a map and trying to find patterns in it. The last one in the bottom right is one of my experiments, which is similar to a fog concept, which you would have seen popularly in games, and tries to map my memories in a fog. So this is a small glimpse of the kind of work that I do, and in today's webinar, I want to focus a bit on a lot of data and then finding good examples to try and show what we can do with this data. So obviously, here's a quick infographic to just set some context that we have huge amount of data being created every day, every minute. You can see some of the popular apps over here, LinkedIn, YouTube, Snapchat, Twitter, and you realize that the amount of stuff that's happening is huge. With this sort of a huge amount of data, it's even more important for us to understand this and then find ways to experience it beyond just seeing it as a chart. So let's get started. The idea here would be to now cut it short to maybe 30 minutes or even 20 minutes and look at a couple of examples of projects that do this very well. Feel free to use the comment section to try and ask any questions, or if you have something specific that you want to know, and I'll be happy to talk a bit more about it. Okay, so designing with data for curiosity. Let's look at some examples that get started with this sort of an approach. This is how a typical Facebook analytics page looks like. You would have a chart, you would have some set of numbers which are around likes, how many fans, how many people talking about it, etc. This is a very traditional visualization or a dashboard. It has a very common chart type, has some numbers thrown in as well. But what else could you do with this? So here's a project done by this company called Informative. They worked with a particular cafe and they tried to instead change the way social media data could be visualized. So on the wall, they created this sort of a beautiful looking tree. You could see that each and every branch has been visualized based on one type of social media activity. A lot of properties of that social media activity have been used to enhance it. So if a photo is there that was posted, it has a different color, a message has a different color, a link or something else has a different color. It unfolds based on how big the message length is. The time of posting changes things as well. And so suddenly this becomes a very different way to visualize the same data. The data is the same social media page, but instead it brings it in a physical, tangible form onto the wall, into the area where the space is. That makes this conversation very different. So let's look at a few more examples. Here's another visualization. This is done by Georgia Lupi's team called Accurat, a brilliant sort of journalism and data art team. So I highly recommend you seeing some of their work. This specific visualization is super interesting because it talks about different painters and it visualizes their life. And what I find interesting is how they've come up with a different way of showing an information which probably would have been shown as a paragraph, a piece of text, or maybe just numbers. So let's zoom in a bit and see some of the details. So you can see that they've come up with a different legend or a different way to look at each and every painter. And then for each painter, they've made these intricate looking visualizations or data art pieces where they look at different parts of their life, when were the first painting, when was their most interesting paintings made, what was the quantity, what were the different artistic periods that they belonged to. And this makes the same probably monotonous, slightly serious data set of talking about a painter, talking about art history in a much more interesting way. So you can see different very modern painters like Pollock, Dali, Picasso, which I'm hoping everyone has heard of, even Mondrian, Kandinsky, which are much more known for their abstract work. And then in a single view, you can look at the lives of different painters. And this gives a different view to how art has changed over years, but specifically to us, it gives a new way for us to show the data. So let's move forward. I'm hoping this space is good enough for everyone to follow along and also hopefully have some questions at the end. So I'm going to show a few more examples. Let's look at some more examples where we see patterns that change across time. This has been one of my favorite visualizations of late. This is done with data of climate change, specifically around temperature and temperature anomalies for every country over the past one century. So it starts from early 1900s, goes all the way till 2016. And if you notice, you see all the countries from the top right all the way in a circular fashion. They've been grouped by different continents. And the visualization starts very subtly, you can see right now, shows how there have been temperature anomalies in each country over years. You'll notice some countries are slightly colder, some countries slightly warmer during the initial years. But as and when we come closer to today, so with 1990s, you start seeing that's generally been way more warm. So the temperature anomalies have suddenly risen to show that there's been a much more common occurrence of the weather being way warmer than what we would expect. And this has been a great way to talk about climate change. So you can now see the difference in this single animation. You can also see a small chart on the top that shows the graph, but the animation itself is so powerful. The use of colors over here get the message across instantly. So here's a similar project. This project that was done in collaboration with a PhD scholar in University of Colorado and with Mapbox. And we are focusing here on trying to see different communities growing in OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap is a platform for you to share geographic data in an open way. So think of it like a Wikipedia for maps. And this project was specifically analyzing between different years as the community changed. Are there more people? Are there less people in a particular area? And how can we visually see this? So unlike the last example where we used animation to go through time, in this example we used a very simple comparison tool to try and compare the data over time. So this has been a very interesting tool for us to start talking about the OSM community, to show this sort of a visual data which would otherwise be shown just as numbers. So let's move forward. Let's look at a few more examples. How about designing with data for seeing something that we can't see? So a lot of data is very direct, visual form. It's about things that we can clearly see. But here is an example of something that is not so obvious. This is done for the Poetry on the Road project. It's a literature festival, and for each year's edition, they create this very abstract sort of poster or piece. This particular one takes all the information about each poem that's part of the festival and then visualizes it on a circle. So the longer the poem, or the more common the characters, or the more common the letters, the different forms they take. And this sort of a very abstract view of how all the poems are in this festival really gives an intriguing insight into how different poems have been structured. So a similar project was something that I worked on, where I looked at this movie called The 500 Days of Summer. I'm hoping some of you have watched it. It's a non-linear movie, which means that the movie is not shown in a chronological order. It is shown with days, sometimes way forward, sometimes way backward. And the technique used here was to put this whole timeline in a spiral. And what made this movie really interesting was that a lot of days were shuffled between when the boy and the girl, who the story is about, were in love and together, which is the pink circles, and when they broke up, which is the dark purple circle. And this sort of a contrast in how the story actually changes was much more evident visually than it would be if I would have just seen the movie or talked about it. And this is just an example of many examples where you would want to take a data, or you would want to show something that you can't generally see visually, but you can see in this sort of a visual form. So here is how the visualization eventually looks like. It talks about the 500 days of their relationship, and it shows how the initial days were when they met, and then there were these days when they were together, which are in pink, and then the days when they broke up. And you can see these arcs that move from the days when they were together to the days when they were not together, and that's what makes this movie really, really interesting. Alright, so there's been also another very interesting field that has emerged over the past few days, and this field is generally referred to as quantified self, which is a much more formal name of this field. But in general, the field focuses on finding ways to use data that you generate and represent yourself. So here is an example. This is a project done by Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Pozovic. They stayed at different continents, and they decided to take letter writing as a form to visualize their lives and share it with each other. The idea being that you would look at a particular week, you would try and collect data in a particular form, and then each of them would try and show it in a visual form. So you can see on the left, a week of complaints have been visualized in a form of a music piece. It's an interesting way to encode the same data. And the right side, the same sort of data, which is around complaints, has been visualized in a very abstract form of ribbons or lines. And this sort of a project became a huge hit. You can see on the right side the different kind of letters that they sent every week. They're very visually different and very visually stark, and it gave an impression of how data does not need to look like common charts, like bar charts or pie charts, and it could actually be shown in a much more unique or visual form that you choose. And I'm hoping that this particular project would give you more inspiration to look at data beyond the conventional visualizations that you would normally see. Here is another example. This is Feltron's annual reports. Nicholas Feltron is one of the guys who worked on the Facebook timeline and behind the new design of the timeline the way we see it today. And he's popularly known for his annual report. So he would meticulously collect data about him, about his life for a whole year, and then at the end of the year, he would publish a report about him. You can see that the report is very interesting with different sort of insights into his life. For example, the people that he was most connected with, the locations around the world that he visited, some sort of visual form of showing different travels that he's done at different quarters. And this became a really interesting visual artifact to look back at your life, but also to share it with others and try and see if others would find it as interesting as you would for your own glimpse into your own life. And here is another sort of tangent to the same sort of project. So in the previous project, we looked at Nicholas Feltrin's own life in a particular poster form. And in this project, we look at two artists trying to visualize interesting parts of their life on a piece of paper. In a similar form, you could try and create a whole startup or a whole product that creates visualizations in a form that are unique to you. So here is a first example. This project is called Meshu. It was a huge hit. It was a website that allowed you to share different places that you've been in. So on the top left, you can see a satellite imagery with an abstract shape. So you would point out, okay, these are the common locations that I generally visit. It would connect those to create an abstract plot. And then it would 3D print it or laser cut it to give you a jewelry. Now this became an interesting example of what you could do with personal data. So you would be able to wear your own personal history in a form of a jewelry. And the beautiful part of this becomes that for each person, this jewelry would be unique because their own way of traveling around the space would be different. So for example, I stay in Bangalore. I generally frequently travel in the central part and a bit of south of Bangalore. And so my connections or my abstracted visual form would be very different from someone else who might be, for example, staying in Delhi and traveling maybe from Delhi to Gurgaon or Delhi to Noida, or someone who's in Hyderabad and traveling in the high-tech city area. And this sort of an approach of creating something from your own data in a physical form also gives a bit of joy or a bit of value in possessing something like this. So here is a similar project that I worked on. So while I was in design school doing my master's, I visualized each student's name, and the way I did this was to plot the whole alphabet from A to Z on a circle, add letters starting from A in the bottom, going all the way till M, N on the top, and then coming all the way back till Z in the bottom, and then taking someone's name, taking all the letters in their name, and then trying to plot them on this circle. So instead of just writing people's names and making like a poster out of it, instead I created these gems out of each person's name. So you'll notice that my professor, who was the coordinator of this course, called Chakradhar Saswade, his name had a lot of C's and A's, and in general his name was way closer to the starting of the alphabet, which meant that his name became a bit more reddish because I chose a red, green, blue sort of a spectrum. Whereas another friend of mine called Nupur, her name has letters that come way later in the alphabet, around N, O, V. And this became interesting as a polygon because her name ended up being a gem that was slightly bluish in color. So this sort of an abstract representation of each person's form becomes more unique when you give it in a form that they've not seen it before in. And what you could also do is not just keep it in a digital form or print it as a poster, but you could also 3D print it. So I took my own name, I created a similar sort of vector form out of it, a polygon, and then I 3D printed it in the small disk that you can see on the right side. So I hope these two examples get you excited about thinking of newer ways to visualize your own data, your names, your birthdays, when you wake up, when you go to college, or when you go to office, maybe how you've been posting on Facebook, how you've been tweeting, and try and give it a form that is much more unique than common charts or bar charts, or trying to just make like a list of those things. So let's look at a bit more serious topic. So data could not just be used for fun or for creating personal artifacts like we just saw, but it could also be used for much more serious sort of issues like civic issues, or used to create ways in which we can take decisions about something that has a huge impact. So let's look at one or two examples for this. Here is an example that was done by a Z magazine. It's a German magazine, and they looked at how Germany is still divided even years after the breaking of the German wall that divided East and West Germany. It was super interesting to see how the country is still very segregated. You can clearly see the separation in the country. You can see how income splits the country, how agriculture splits the country. Even average age of people is very clearly different. And this sort of very simple visual representation of how the country is still not cohesive or not mixed made it very interesting for the policymakers to think about what sort of steps should we take to try and find new ways to get the east and the west part of our country to come closer together. I would love to see a similar visualization for a country as diverse as India, and I'm sure we could find more interesting stories around this. So here's another project that I worked on very recently. This was done for the Washington DC government, and we looked at the traffic fatalities in Washington DC. We tried to visualize it at three different levels. So you could look at a zoomed out view of the city. You could see which parts of the city have the most accidents. So you can see the central part gets the highest number of accidents. And you can also look at, okay, between traffic accidents, how many of them involved a bicyclist, how many of them involved a pedestrian. And then we also used a bit of machine learning to try and find what would be the biggest choke points, or what would be the traffic intersections that have the highest possibility of crashes. And as we zoom in, let's just wait for this to zoom in, yeah. So as we zoom in, you can notice that the pink peach circles that show up on the top are specific intersections that our machine learning algorithm kind of visualized and highlighted. And this became a really interesting story. We presented this in the Smart Cities Week as well in Washington, DC. And it showed the city admins, the city policymakers, a new way to look at their city and to try and find new regulations or new laws to make the city safer. So let's move on. Let's try and wrap up this webinar by 9 o'clock. So I'm going to show you a few more examples, and then we can take a few questions or maybe conversations just around what tools do I use or how you can learn to do something similar. So let's look at this particular set. So a lot of times we come with data which you have seen or which you have known very well, but you could look at the same sort of view in a very different way. So this technique is called a cartogram. It skews a world map or any map in a form that is based on real data and not really on the geographic area. So in this case, you can see that the world map has been twisted or skewed based on different properties that I'm clicking on the top. You can see if we look at population, Asia really stands out, whereas wealth gives Europe and America a higher ground. If we look at emissions, we can see which countries or which nations have been historically considered high emission countries. And then you can look at poverty and realize that in terms of poverty, Africa and Asia and China specifically and India really stand out in the world compared to the rest of the Western world. And this becomes interesting as storytelling too. You're taking a familiar shape, that is the world map, and then you're trying to use data to change it and to visualize more interesting parts of the world. So here's another project that I had worked on. This visualizes railway connections that are from four major metros in India, that is Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, and Kolkata, to the rest of the country. And it became an interesting sort of piece to talk about how the rest of the India is connected to these major metros. On the right, you can see the final shape, and it kind of feels like India because you can somehow recognize the overall shape, but you can very clearly see parts of India that are still not very well connected. You can definitely see east part of India, so all the sister states over there, which only have one or two direct trains from Kolkata or Delhi. You can also see how cities emerge. For example, Hyderabad and Bangalore are very clearly visible as dark spots on this visualization because they are very well connected with the major metros. And you can also see one of the longest railroads, one of the longest rails that we have in India, which goes from Delhi all the way to the Kanyakumari. And this again became an interesting conversation starter to talk about how our country is connected or disconnected with a transport medium that is probably the only affordable medium for most of the country. All right, let's move forward to see a few more examples. In this particular set, I want to talk about data which is immensely complex, and we find ways to design with this data so that we can understand this complexity. So here is a first project. This is called Hive Plots. This was actually a new visualization technique that was designed to visualize huge amount of connected data. You can see in the top an example of how it looks. It's a circular diagram, and compare it with the traditional form of visualization, which are very messy, which while being very accurate do not actually explain to us what is happening. And these hive plots became an interesting technique to talk about different really complex systems. You could look at a genetic system or a particular organism and then try and visualize that at scale. You could try and look at network structures and try and find out which part of a huge network or a data center would or would not collapse based on just a visual representation. And this is one of my favorite examples to show something as complex, say, as the gene structure of a particular organism in a very simple and crisp visual form. So similarly, here's another project. This project is something that I worked on over the past year, which was around showing how a particular map gets changed by a community. So similar to how Google Map allows you to edit some particular data, similarly OpenStreetMap, which is like a Wikipedia for maps, allows people to contribute different data sets or contribute details about the real world. But what's more interesting is to see how people change or edit or try and fix these details. So you can see the major image in this particular slide shows how somebody meticulously went ahead and realigned different building points to really match the updated satellite imagery. He or she has also gone ahead and added a lot more detail in these smaller roads that you can see in light blue, whereas the yellow and the orange show things that have changed or have been modified. On the right, you can see similar examples of how different visual changes look like, which are actually underlying map data that are being changed. And so this is just one of the many examples of showing really complex data, which is really hard to understand, but becoming very easy to process once you show them visually with a set of color encoding, with a form of visual encoding. And this helps us track vandalism, or basically find out if somebody is adding data that isn't real or is adding graffiti or different shapes that don't exist in the real world on a map. Like you can see in the bottom right, where somebody's just gone ahead and added random lines on the map. And this sort of a complex structure of data is now very easily seen visually, and you can quickly take decisions as to whether this should be on a map or should not be on a map. And so we have a few more minutes left, so let's just quickly wrap this up, but keep some time for questions. So there's a lot more to be designed. There is a lot of data sets, and then there are also a lot of ways to visualize. So here is one of my favorite charts, which is in the Information is Beautiful book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you read it. It has a small glimpse of the many different types of visualizations that you can make. It goes from bubble charts or bubble comparison visualizations to something like a concept fan or a spiral, which are very unique ways to show data. And having this sort of a sort of taxonomy or a list of different things that you can do is always helpful for you to explore what you can do with visualization. And here's another example. This is way back in 1960s, and this is a good example to say that this visualization technique, or in general this act of taking data and visualizing it, is not really new. It's been there for a really long time, and people have been focusing on finding new ways to use data in design. And so I'll wrap up this webinar with two quotes. A lot of people started using this quote, which says that data is the new oil. So just like how oil has led to so much of market potential, data is also the same way. But I prefer this other quote by David McCandless, which says that data is the new soil. And that's a much better way to look at it, because unlike oil, which finishes over time and it's actually not really helping us, soil is much more positive. It has positive connotations of being a fertile and creative medium. And that is, in a sense, what data is. It is giving us an opportunity to try and create new things, new forms of content, new forms of applications, new forms of visualizations in a much more creative way. So with that, thanks a lot. My name is Rasagya. If you're on Twitter, you can find me on @Rasagya, and feel free to ask me any questions. I am also happy to take any questions on live chat if somebody has. Perfect. So we have one question from Shiv Kumar, who's asking what kind of tools can be used to visualize data in these formats and also apply different types of algorithms. So that's a great question. I think I'm hoping very relevant to the audience that is listening to us today as well. There are several different forms to approach visualization. It just depends on your tech background or your fluency with a particular programming language or a particular tool. So if you're using things like Python, or if you're using things like R, you would have inbuilt libraries like ggplot or matplotlib, which are great to get started in trying to visualize this sort of data. You can also create very easy interactive visualizations. For example, R, which is in general used for a lot of heavy statistical computing, also has this very interesting library called Shiny, which allows you to push visualization as an interactive dashboard. You can also look at a lot of tools that allow you to create these visualizations without writing any code. My favorite amongst these is Tableau. It's a great tool. It has a great community, and you can also find free versions for students that are available. There's also a free public version which you can use to upload a data set, or you can buy the full version and then create data visualizations. The favorite part there being that when you push a data or you add a data set to it, it'll suggest you visualizations that can be created. And I found that to be immensely helpful as a tool. You can also try Google Charts. That's also a pretty incredible bare bone, really useful chart types which you can throw in. And then there are similar sort of new age visualization tools or libraries like B3. There's freer graphic libraries like P5. And then there are libraries that are built on top of this, like Vega, which is also Vega Lite. There are raw graphs, etc. So there are a lot of tools And finding tools is generally not the hard part. It is finding a story to tell with your data, or finding an algorithm that can find an interesting part of the data set, which is much more harder. And I'm hoping that the examples that I showed would give you enough inspiration to try something more unique than the common bar charts that you would normally see. Cool, we can take one more question if somebody has another question. Otherwise, feel free to message me on Facebook or on Twitter, and I'll be happy to take more questions and maybe share more resources which might be useful. Okay, so if you have a question, I would like you to drop it in the live chat. If not, let's wrap this up. So I'll just give you one more minute for any last question. If anybody has any interest in asking about any of these projects, you can ask a bit about Mapbox, about my work. Happy to talk a bit about it as well. All right, looks like everyone is happy to stay silent, in which case let's wrap this up. Thanks a lot, Apurva, for inviting me to do this. Thanks a lot, Pawan, for helping out with all the technical difficulties that we faced earlier during the day. And I'm hoping this was useful. Feel free to share any feedback that you have about the webinar in the Google developer group as well on Facebook, or you can directly message me as well. Thanks a lot. Oh, okay. So it seems like there are a few more questions that have come in the last minute. So let me just quickly take those and then we can wrap this up. One question is around how can we arrange historical data? This is interesting. I would love to actually know more details about what sort of arrangements are you looking at. But in general, you could look at time as a single axis and then try and show data on top of it. Or you could use visualization techniques like animations, which I showed for climate data, which is also historical. Or you could also look at just comparing two different states in a historical data set. So you have two different points and you can use comparison. Let's quickly look at some of those. So just to recap about this, I'm just going to quickly skim through this. So we saw this, which is a very interesting technique to take historical data and then animate it and show the change over time. Or this technique where we can compare two different states. So in this case, we're comparing 2008 and 2017, and then using color to show the change that has happened. So I hope that answers the question around historical data. Apurva has asked, can we show visualization while building a prototype? This is an interesting question because a lot of times you don't actually have real data and you're prototyping a concept or you're prototyping an app and you want to show what it might look like. In a lot of cases, when we try and work on conceptual visualizations, we use a dummy set of data. We try and think of what could be a possible form of the data, try and visualize that, and then we move forward with prototyping, getting feedback, iterating on it, and then eventually publishing this visualization. So yes, you could try and use any visualization tool like Tableau, like Google Charts, like Excel. Take that and add that with dummy data set into your prototype, and then eventually create a much more interactive way to use this. If you are slightly interested in programming with web fundamentals like web frameworks, you can play around with tools such as D3, P5, which would allow you to make very quick prototypes and use data in it. Yeah, and to wrap up, if you have really huge data sets and you want to look at insights, you want to try and find ways to chop up that data set into either smaller pieces and then look at smaller parts of the data set, find interesting questions to ask, and then try and ask the same question on the whole data set. Or you could try and use any simple tool to get some early insights, find outliers or find patterns that are commonly not visible in the data set, but there are some edges or some parts of it that have some clear outliers or indications, which would make an interesting story. My favorite tool for doing this is Tableau because it doesn't require me to write any code. I can quickly drop a data set which could be as huge as maybe a few hundred MBs of data, and then you can very quickly select different properties or different columns in your data set and then visualize it. If you have a bit more statistical knowledge, feel free to also try out R, which has a really good community around it as well. And it has very simple ways for you to use statistical operations on a huge data set and then create visual artifacts or very quick visualizations out of it as well. So I'm hoping that answers some of the questions. If you want more conversations around it, feel free to reach out to me personally and I'll be happy to have longer conversations or take up follow-up questions about this. So yeah, I hope this helped. Let's wrap this up. Thanks a lot. Have a nice evening, everyone.